this is
We all just, we all know.
Yes.
All right, dear colleagues, hello. Thank you for coming. Let us begin, because of course people will be arriving, but we will be already on our way. Right? It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our alumna, Marijeta Bozovic, whom you certainly know. And Marijeta will be introducing her most recent book. But before she starts doing that, I just want to say a few words about her and about her professional biography. And Marijeta, in many ways, is the Slavist we want you to be. Okay, there are so many Slavic graduates here, so you can look at Marijeta and try to reach this level, although it's probably enforceable. Marijeta is
I paid $20 to say that.
let's not disclose. So anyway, so why I'm saying this? Because indeed Marijeta is working in different directions, and she's not only a literary scholar, she's affiliated with film media studies and with gender sexuality studies. Her first book is about Nabokov, and Nabokov canon from Onegin to Ada, which basically suggests Anglophone Nabokov, right? But her next project, a big collection, Watersheds, is about South Slavic cultures, literatures, poetics and politics at Danube River, and basically Marijeta works in multiple subfields of our profession. She's both Russianist and Slavist in a broader sense. She writes about modernism and contemporary culture. She works with diasporas and transnational cultures, translation, remediation, so digital humanities, new media and cultural networks. Imagine that, right? However, so you all are familiar with this famous dichotomy of foxes and hedgehogs, and foxes are frequently being subjected to criticism that they know too little about too much, right? But that's not the case again, because each of Marijeta's book is sort of groundbreaking and creating a new field. And the book that we are going to talk today is one of such books. Certainly, you will hear more from Marijeta, and you will have a chance to ask her questions, but it is indeed important, not only because it is, to my estimation, the first English language book about contemporary poetry, so the Russophone contemporary poetry of the recent years. Secondly, it is the first Anglophone, and not non-Anglophone, I would say, book about the left poetics in Russian context. In a broader context, we have such work, but in Russian context, it is the first book, right? And although the book was finished, as far as I know, prior to 2022, it sounds increasingly relevant today, and especially today, right, when we are trying to redefine and reconceptualize Russophone culture and find some new foundations for its understanding. Marijeta's book is offering us a paradigm in which, or from which, we can continue work. So I think that I should stop here and give the floor to Marijeta.
Thank you so much. And I want to say it's incredibly moving to be back here. So many years after having studied here myself, it's also, I'm so delighted to be invited by Mark and Valentina, who can't be here today, but I see Tom, something I love. Mark and Valentina in different ways are really responsible for me being in this profession and doing what I do. Valentina, very literally, she recruited me to Columbia Slavic in 2002, the spring of 2002, and a very memorable office visit, and I was just done. And Mark has modeled for me over the years and decades a kind of scholarship, including work of the contemporary, which initially was a frightening move for me to make. But reading what Mark was doing, meeting him at conferences, interacting with him, gave me a kind of vision for what I wanted to do and the kind of scholar I wanted to be as well. Also, Mark has seen so many iterations of this book project. We have talked about it at conferences. He has peer-reviewed it very clearly a number of times, recognizable style. I always know it's Mark. He has line edited, I don't know how many chapters of it. So indeed, I always think, there's one name on the cover when a book comes out, but there's actually a kind of village of people helping and supporting and correcting and criticizing and helping it come into existence. And Mark is absolutely one of these people. So I want to say also that I began writing this book at a completely different geopolitical moment. I've worked on it for over 10 years. And the central problem that I wanted to address was that of a new left. So again, I want to be very clear, not a liberal opposition or even a progressive opposition, but a left in post-socialist spaces. And my kind of opening question was, what kind of language can you possibly use to critique capitalism and talk about socioeconomic class and inequality, to speak of cross-class solidarity, to dream of some kind of more egalitarian global future in spaces where we had grown allergic to state socialist linguistic cliches. And my insight, my hunch was that we should look to the leftist experimental poets, what I call the post-Soviet avant-garde, to look for an emergence of that kind of language and to see what they were doing with language more generally. I'll also note that the poet protagonist of this book started raising the alarm and specifically using the term fascism to describe political and cultural trends in the Russian mainstream as early as the early noughts. So 2000 in Kirill Medvedev's case, the title of his first book of poetry, after all, was Всё плохо, everything is bad. 2012 was an epicenter of hope. This was a very different period in Russia. Those were the Medvedev years, years when the country and world were genuinely shocked by what happened with the members of the Pussy Riot. These were years of seemingly radical uses of social media, again, also think globally, 2010, 2011, Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, a sense of a politicized youth culture internationally. Indeed, these were years when Masha Gessen, hardly the terminal optimist, speculated in mainstream American newspapers that the Russian regime might fall any moment. By today, nearly every single one of the protagonists of this book has fled the country. Aleksandr Skidan has gone back, or in one case is dead. So I wanted to dedicate the talk tonight to the memory of Dmitry Golynko, who I think about and miss every time I think about this poetry or new media or their politics. And I want to say again, in Mitya's honor, that I don't think the effort of describing this phenomenon 20 years in the making, in the sense of this poetics, or that I'll discuss today, was futile, because it happened, because most survived, because the networks persist in diaspora and are reforming in unexpected configurations and with new allies. And despite the devastating time of retreat we are in now, there are legacies and influences that will linger and that I believe surprising, unexpected futures. I foresee surprising, unexpected futures to the kind of alternative republic of letters that I've tried to describe. So for the project and the thesis of the project, 15, 20 years ago, when asked the question of what can politically engaged aesthetic productions from the former Soviet Union tell us about socialism, popular audiences and scholars alike would have answered the question by talking about dissidents, those who fled the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Indeed, throughout the 20th century, dissidents provided popular and critical Western discourses alike with vivid tales of the treachery of leftist utopian thought and the courage of individual resistance. However, and I pulled this image from Newsweek, the irony is that in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the former Second World never needed Marxist critique more. As the political scientist Stephen Crowley suggests, the central irony underlining contemporary Russian socioeconomic structures and their systematic study has been that Russian society requires class-based analysis more than ever, of course, in the wake of its official discrediting. The rapid transfer of property into private hands that took place in Russia in the wake of disintegration, I'll remind you, remains virtually unrivaled even in Eastern Europe. And I'll quote Crowley here: according to the World Bank, starting from a position of relative equality, Russia's increase in its Gini inequality index of 11 percentage points over a decade was close to a record. This concentration of property and wealth took place not during a period of economic growth, but one of dramatic decline, significantly worse than the US experience of the Great Depression. One study of Russian social mobility in the 90s, comparing class origins with class destinations, found that from 1990 to 1998, downward mobility exceeded upward mobility by 30%. And the downward shift of that, let alone of that magnitude, is highly unusual among mature economies. By one estimate, the number of poor in Russia increased from 2.2 million in 1987 to 66 million by 1993 to 1995. And then a year after the 1998 financial crisis, 4 out of every 10 people in the Russian Federation slipped into poverty, unable to meet nutritional and other basic needs. And yet, nobody was talking about it in those terms. The taboo topic of socioeconomic class remained under-examined by Russian social scientists and political rhetoric alike. Theory lagged far way behind the horrors of lived experience. And the notable exception was the rise of political and socially conscious themes in popular culture and a number of different aesthetic productions. In short, the intellectual work of rebuilding class-based critique emerged more prominently in the arts than in other spaces, with, again, an exceptional peak in 2012, the long year of Russian and international protest. So that's the backdrop for this project. In the book, I explore one specific such artistic arena of social critique: the Russian language poets Aleksandr Skidan, Dmitry Golynko, Keti Chukhrov, Kirill Medvedev, Osminkin, Pavel Arseniev, and Galina Rymbu. Again, it's best to say Russophone because their ethnicities and identifications are mixed. These groups, they're both individually fascinating actors, but they're also part of a larger constellation. They worked together and found their footing and voices in many ways linked by the journal Translit. Also a number of chapbook series, the Free Marxist Press, a number of poetry festivals, events, actions in Russia and abroad, continuing in Marseille and Berlin today in some cases. Moreover, this group was united by overt political engagement and explicit Marxist orientation. Half the group were active members of the Russian Socialist Movement political party, thereby very clearly occupying a fraught position in post-socialist space and time. So I conceptualize this group, this constellation, as a contemporary avant-garde, and the use of prefixes in my title, which gestures at the temporal paradoxes of a revived futurism. My thesis, summed, is that contemporary Russian poets seek in the legacies of historical avant-gardes, the historical Russian avant-gardes of the 1910s and 1920s, as well as subsequent waves, undetonated alternatives to both the neoliberal global present and, again, to the still recently discredited institutionalized left of the Communist Party. I read this latest return of the Russian avant-garde as drawing on powerful local literary counter-traditions, but reimagined through, reinvigorated by, and in solidarity with a range of international theory and art practice. Or to rephrase, these post-Soviet praxis take inspiration from and claim continuity with historical guards, but dialectically influenced by international critical theory, and all of it stitched through with a common red thread. Through various forms of embodied poetic practices, performances at protests that merge with digital remediation and dissemination, as well as through the prodigious translation of poetry, critical theory, and political philosophy from around the globe, this newest Russian avant-garde creates very, very distinctive congeries of the local and transnational. Through the study, translation, modification, and reappropriation of these still incendiary global texts, these poets tried to create models of politically engaged translocal collectivities. Russian poetry merges in their experiments with other forms, media, and languages through digital remediation, collective translation practices, and immediate dissemination via online platforms. Show a couple blogs here. Meanwhile, efforts to think leftwards, beyond a state socialist past or its remnants, to a global egalitarian future, challenge both Russian and, again, Western narratives in our increasingly interconnected world. Moreover, I think it's important to distinguish this kind of avant-garde return from Soviet nostalgia. These are highly aware cultural appropriations and remediations that indeed can be read more as a reaction to mainstream and official nostalgia for the imperial and militant aestheticized politics of the Soviet Union, such as the Putin regime's ready embrace of the cult of World War II. Instead, here we see reimaginings and renewed engagement with historical Russian and Soviet avant-gardes that are ranging from appropriative to critical. So any forward-looking renewal of avant-garde energies necessarily includes important correctives, not least along lines of gender and sexuality, which poets like Keti Chukhrov and Galina Rymbu have engaged with very explicitly. So I study poetic practices in this book that range from what I term the poetics of refusal, when the critique of literary institutions makes further publication impossible and transubstantiates poetry into something else, maybe activism, to very difficult, kind of arcane philosophical poetry modeled after Arkady Dragomoshenko and inspired by his exchanges with the very recently late Lynn Haginian and the American academic language school poets. I'm fascinated also in the sites of publication and performance, and in the reemergence of the avant-garde journal today as still an incredibly effective venue, art object, collective cause, and social network. Of course, in today's variants, it has a very active presence, both often online. Again, in many of these cases, I'll be talking about poets who test the limits of digital dissemination in various ways, but it's also important that they embody their poetics in performances that at times insist on the physical presence of the poet in dangerous or illegal circumstances. So I'll give just a few playful examples of the variety of practices of the poets united by the translit constellation. The first is by Pavel Arseniev, a kind of executive figure of the group. One of his very early and very charming manifesto poems reads, Продается Mayakovsky. We'll give you the Russian and English. Продается у Маяковски на новой торговой площадке Рунета. Рекламные ссылки добавить, послать ссылку другу, найдутся все. Неограниченный трафик, чем заняться в свободное время, картинки. Еще. So, as is typical of Arseniev's work, it is difficult to identify Mayakovsky for sale as either a poem or the textual component of a composite artwork. It has been both. Mayakovsky for Sale was published as a poem in translit, labeled from the cycle Ready Written. You can hear right there the borrowing from the language school. The corresponding video of how the poem is made has been published online and performs or explains its composition. Screen captured video, I'll go back to this slide, shows the narrator cursor, presumably Arseniev, logging into his email account and running a word search for Mayakovsky. The cursor hovers over but quickly skips past the content of an email exchange that mentions Lipovetsky. If the viewer pauses, rewinds, and replays the video, it is possible to read fragments of a sensible exchange with a LiveJournal blogger back in the day regarding Arseniev's ideas about political poetry. But the cursor, however, heads for the advertisements and miscellaneous textual effluvia hovering at the edges of the screen. While the cursor selects the words and phrases that make up the poem, Arseniev's digitized voice reads aloud the oddly evocative words. So the video offers a kind of glimpse into a fairly characteristic play across media, across collaborative and performative poetics, and playful, often self-parodic use of new technology. The piece also crosses very smoothly from individual to collective creation. The poem is by Arseniev, a single author. The video piece is by the group Laboratory of Poetic Actions, a collaboration with Osminkin and fellow poet Dmitry Golynko, close to the group at the time. Poem and art object coexist in offline and online formats, taking advantage in each instance of the particular context of their framing. Arseniev's most famous line of poetry, however, was one of the most recognized slogans of the 2011-2012 protest movements. That, emblazoned across the banner, became a multiply remediated image of protest. Вы нас даже не представляете, you don't even represent us, you can't even imagine us, punning on the two meanings of the verb представлять, resulting again in twinned readings of the slogan. This line, which was photographed and blazoned on a red banner and reproduced since in gallery format on magazine covers, really became a kind of stand-in for, again, a long gone period, a stand-in for the wit and youthful energy of the 2012 protests as a whole. The pun, again, is also characteristic. So it borders on the conceptual, a kind of, you don't represent us politically, you cannot even imagine us. But of course, again, pushing with a conceptualist background, the words themselves fail to represent. So there's a kind of Magritte-like, this is not a pipe, language game. However, in this particular context, it means something very legible and tangible politically, pragmatically charged with its particular context, which again is something that really interests me. This turn and play with conceptualism differently charged. And then I thought I'd give an example closer to home. In February of 2015, the exhibition Spectres of Communism, Contemporary Russian Art, opened actually in two New York locations, the James Gallery at the CUNY Graduate Center and eFlux. Curated by Boris Groys, the show presented work by a collection of contemporary Russian cultural figures. Keti Chukhrov, the Что делать collective, Anton Vidokul of eFlux, Pussy Riot. Groys's introductory essay made very clear the premise of his curatorial selection. Taking inspiration from Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx, Groys chose works that suggest that communism continues to haunt Russia as well as the West. The conceptual work suggested by that haunting, however, only goes so far. Groys's conceit, with its characteristic emphasis on the transformation of life into art, suited the more formalist pieces, but as a number of reviewers, including Anastasia Osipova, noted immediately, the most compelling work in the show looked forward as well as backward. Again, not just haunting, but really engaging directly with the topic of emergence of new political subjectivity. Okay, another image from Love Machines. In form as in content, Chukhrov's standout piece for the Spectres of Communism show reads as an act of collective conjuring. 2013 video is based on Chukhrov's text, a verse drama structurally familiar to readers of her other poetic work. Chukhrov's classically trained voice is also heard in several unexpected bursts of song in the piece. But the video is shot and edited by others, Sergei Shilov and Viktor Olympiev, respectively. The actors include other poets and artists well known in Russian leftist circles, such as Dina Gatina, Arseniy Zhulayev, the latter also featured in Groys's show, as well as the group Trupa Rupor and the artistic director Semyon Filipov. So Love Machines, even though it's presented as such, is really hardly video art by Chukhrov, so much as a far more difficult to place collaborative co-production based on her written work and made with her full participation. The content of this highly experimental verse drama is harder described, reading as a kind of allegory that refuses entirely to signify its secondary meaning. The love machines in question, this part is clear, are futuristic androids sent to intervene in the meaningless lives of contemporary Muscovites through some kind of seduce and destroy or perhaps accelerate mechanism. We seem to view three stages of development simultaneously. There's a cow, there's a human, then there's the futurist machine that appear to be trapped together in a kind of black box of shared destiny and responsibility. The human remainder, in as much as it can be delineated and differentiated from the other two, is hardly appealing. Yet the elite formation of the futurist cyborgs who would eliminate all who cannot rise to their standards also hilariously falls from any moral high ground. And the cyborgs' warm-up exercises are in fact the bullshit. This is what they kind of chant as they're warming up and turning off. Alexei Kruchonik's most quoted line of avant-garde assault on Russian poetry from 1912. So we can read this as a mocking rebuke of one kind of avant-garde teleology. There's definitely a tautological whiff here of Groys's Total Art of Stalinism from 1988, which drew a very direct and speedy line of descent from the Russian revolutionary avant-garde to high Stalinism. And I think this probably explains Groys's attraction to the piece. However, I would argue that this is parody on Keti Chukhrov's part. What Chukhrov is interested in exploring across her growing body of work ultimately reads neither as a kind of totalitarian fear-mongering, she's committedly Marxist, but also not as Soviet nostalgia. She is profoundly critical of the failures of institutionalized socialism, not least along imperial grounds as Soviet Georgian herself. So here's a little bit of a backdrop of thinking about the previous generation and where this comes from. And here I'll draw also on Zhenya Dobrenko's work. How can we imagine an updated genealogy of the Russian poetic avant-gardes from today's perspective? It's fascinating that nearly all of my my subjects recognize one of the most important precursors being the conceptualist poet Dmitry Golynko, who has played the role of Russian poet as an extended provocative art performance. And Golynko, in turn, locates his own experiments against the backdrop of the historical avant-gardes. So in Dobrenko's summary, kind of discussing the genealogy of avant-garde art producing in Russia, Golynko distinguished three ages. One, the futurist constructivist, which was then replaced by reaction against the mechanicalness and planned euphoria of the first by Aberyu. And then in the third age, only in the third age, pop art or conceptualist art did the completion of the triad, according to Golynko here, take place, the declaration of the untruthfulness of totalitarian ambitions. So what I'm trying to do is add a fourth turn with this current generation of avant-garde poets, the paradoxically repoliticized post-Soviet avant-garde. But it's also useful to stop and think, why on earth is Golynko so important to this overtly politicized group of poet activists? Well, Golynko brought Russian poetry into the space of contemporary art, specifically into the space of conceptualism and performance. Again, more a poet in quotation marks than a poet. He played Russian poet, and in doing so, already did something with this term. He undermined logocentric tendencies in Russian culture by taking it to a ridiculous extreme. Slavoj Žižek has argued that over-identifying with the explicit power discourse, simply taking the power discourse at its public word, acting as if it really means what it explicitly says and promises, can be the most effective way of disturbing its smooth functioning. Alexei Yurchuk has somewhat similarly defined late Soviet parody. Through such actions, then, Golynko, as his infamous and purposefully offensive performance of Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin as a faux Buddhist mantra, the image I showed here, he can disturb the mystified function of the text precisely by exposing it as sacred. The graphomania of Golynko's enormous poetic output, estimated at more than 40,000 poems, in turn also disrupts a privileged mode of reading, of exegesis, the close reading of a text for its hidden worth and difficulty, the privileged romantic mode, united with the Soviet dissident preoccupation with Aesopian language that could slip subversive meanings past censors. Through its very bulk, Prigov's oeuvre forces us into a kind of distant reading avant la lettre, a reading that moves very rapidly across many poems in search of meta-narratives, not hidden narratives. The change in strategy, in turn, opens up new and unexpected possibilities for subsequent generations of poets. We might compare here Dmitry Golynko's rejection of the romantic and neo-romantic mode as described in his manifesto essay, which was applied social poetry, and it's modeled after or inspired by the work of Arseniev, which I show here. So in that essay, also is an uncharacteristically optimistic essay coming from Dmitry Golynko at that time. He wrote, "In order to give the poetic utterance an applied character, the poet with a radical gesture renounces the principle of aesthetic autonomy and also the use of the stereotypical romantic and modernist character of the poet prophet, demon, or eccentric. At the same time, he is compelled to free himself from the illusion of artistic independence and to admit his absolute dependence on antagonistic social codes and a number of contradictory social voices." So again, Golynko's essay was inspired through exchanges and modeled after the Polish artist Artur Chmielewski's manifesto on applied social art. Chmielewski was also coming out of the group Krytyka Polityczna in Warsaw, about which we can talk a little bit in Q&A if it comes up. Chmielewski had argued, again, at a similarly politically fraught moment in contemporary Polish artistic and political history, that art must be used for the most diverse goals, as an instrument of receiving and disseminating knowledge, as a factory of cognitive procedures based on intuition and imagination, as an occasion for learning and for political action. So Golynko was pushing to translate this, as it were, from Polish to Russian, from art to poetry. And that translation leaves remainders and plenty of room for anxiety, not least over the space of reception. But again, I would point to this, helping to explain precisely why so many of these poetic experiments, while emerging out of poetry and centered around a kind of poetic play and innovation, immediately turn transmedial in their instantiation and performances. Because it changes the way that we interact with that poetry and brings us into a space, again, resembling more the gathering functions of contemporary art shows or theater. So again, linking these two together, I think we can start to derive how a younger generation of performing poets takes strategic advantage of the kind of space opened up by Prigov. And in a 2014 interview with me, Kirill Medvedev suggested the following line of dissent, an explanation. And I quote here in paraphrase, "What was Prigov's accomplishment in large part in that he learned each time with a mass of the most diverse methods to confront the reader with that serious, that modernist approach to art, to the poetic subject, to language in general. That is, you begin reading Prigov's work as verse. And then you understand that it is impossible to read it that way, as verse. But as that frame of mind persists inside of you, it creates a conflict. And on that, it seems to me, it all rests. Each time some kind of neat creation of a unified logocentric subject falls apart. And it falls apart namely through an impulse from below, a kind of direct and immediate and unpoetic discourse. And in that, it seems to me, Roma, he's speaking of Osminkin, has glimpsed some kind of potential for a more democratic approach in Prigov's poetics, and he decided to develop it in a more engaged direction. Indeed, Roman Osminkin uses a line from Prigov as an epigraph to an essay describing his own poetic practice. I think that the most democratic literature is not one that is comprehensible to everyone, but one that pays attention to all conventional linguistic gesture. In the context of Osminkin's prose, the emphasis on democratic literature reads completely differently than in Prigov's use and implies very concrete and specific political goals. I think it's important to note that such practices not only repoliticize, but also even tentatively re-romanticize albeit with accompanying irony, the figure of the poet. Kirill Medvedev has spoken of a weak heroism that he says is necessary in a political moment when cultural figures feel called to social responsibility and even to heroic action, while remaining deeply ambivalent about and profoundly suspicious of the heroic posture of the Russian poet. The image here, for example, depicts Kirill Medvedev with other members of his group Arkady Kots singing The Walls, standing, famous 1968 Catalan protest song, Vestasa, remade into Muri, the anthem of Polish solidarity in 1980s, now in Medvedev's political translation in totally different political context. Here they're performing it in an Avtazak police van when they were arrested while protesting outside of the courtroom during the Pussy Riot trial. Recording and disseminating this impromptu music video, which is one of several that was disseminated on YouTube at the time, clearly shows a kind of conscious political utilization of the cultural capital of the poet in Russian society. And here's a similar pairing from that period from Osminkin. Okay, methods. The study of such forms, I hope, also offers an opportunity to reimagine and occupy a very different space for us as scholars in the Slavic literary studies field. In place of resurgent Cold War dichotomies, what I try to do, how I try to think, is to foreground instead transnational exchanges and political and cultural solidarities. So, show this. The canonization of Kirill Medvedev offers an enlightening case study. So over the course of the past decade and a half, international audiences have more than caught on to a voice that was familiar to Moscow literary circles since about 2000, 2001. For non-Russian readers, this breakthrough coincided with the first volume of his work in English translation, which was, again, It's No Good, which was published in December of 2012 through the efforts of Keith Gesson and Matvey Yankelevich at the Brooklyn-based N+1 and Ugly Duckling Press. Medvedev's essays on politics and aesthetics have since made their way into such publications as the New Left Review, The Guardian, the London Review of Books. In interviews with him, reviews have appeared in The Independent, The Nation, The New Inquiry, The Boston Review, The Chicago Review, The Paris Review, The Los Angeles Review of Books, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, to name a few. In Bomb magazine, Chris Cumming pointed to the striking fact, as he put it, and I quote, that a Marxist activist and a free verse poet who writes for his own blog should get as much attention in America as Medvedev has, including a favorable review in that mouthpiece of socialism and experimental poetry, the New York Times, reflects the tireless publicity work of his publisher N+1. But there's more to it. Many people in America are disgusted by our politics and depressed by our literary culture. And Medvedev's central subject is the miserable marriage of these two. And his own life, even his Russianness, that's still coming speaking, give his opinions a legitimacy on those subjects that American writers lack. He has behind him a tradition of Russian artists who combine political and aesthetic radicalism, something American writers don't really have. Okay, and Cumming speaking, and the problems with this exotic Russian authenticity, all too close to the surface to need much pointing out. Also, American writers lacking a legacy of political radicalism, However, there's an insight there, which is that Medvedev's fairly astonishing popularity attests to more than personal charisma and connections. It's that some period after the end of the Soviet Union, it's not only Russian, but internationalist audiences alike that desperately needed a revival of Russian leftist poetry. So in conclusion, show this, and maybe switch to Black Square protest. What kind of avant-garde legacy is this? It's a pulse beating strongly or weakly in different moments throughout the last century and more, offering up a history of unrealized possibilities and interrupted but resumable projects. The poets of Translit read earlier Russian avant-garde through lenses that have been influenced by decades of international Marxist theory, including the very contemporary, which is now part of the world culture that post-Soviet Russians have reclaimed. Keith Gesson had asked in his introduction to Kirill Medvedev's work, what was it that these newcomers saw that the previous generation of Russian intellectuals failed to understand? And answered his own question with Marxism. Not the Soviet teachings of Karl Marx, but the many intellectual errors of Marx in the West in the post-war era. This is the Marx Frankfurt School and Sartre and the Situationist International, but also figures such as Pierre Bourdieu, the Anglo-American thinkers around the New Left Review, as well as non-aligned thinkers like Barthes, Foucault, and Baudrillard. And Kirill Medvedev corroborated that reading a few years later, writing, "Why doesn't Russia have a normal literary criticism?" And his answer was that because all the major critical theories of the West in the 20th century passed in one way or another through Marxism. He wrote then, until the same happens in Russia, there won't be any criticism at all, not of poetry, nor of the authorities. I want to end with a coda. To end without acknowledging that one story ends with airstrikes, bodies in Bucha, police terror, recognizing grandparents, whispered stories in 1937, the growing, never-ending, and uncountable number of refugees fleeing Ukraine, Belarus, Russia in despair, the first wave of the 21st century, and shocking to use the term first wave in a contemporary context. To not mention that would dishonor the unflinching clarity with which the protagonists of this book spent the past 2 decades warning, predicting rivers of blood. There's a great poem by Skidan, Too Late to Say I Warned You, in 2003, that he wrote after February of 2022. Yet, despite the devastatingly changed circumstances, Skidan also has a metaphor of radical poets appearing briefly here and there, like worms in the rain. Again, I believe that the Republic of Letters, called into being in the years 1999 to 2022, was not a failure, but a cultural formation whose transnational and political and aesthetic influences are far from over. And I'll end with this following Facebook post that Kirill Medvedev wrote to his friends leaving the country in 2022. I would like to say something to those who are leaving now. I can't tell anyone what to do. Everyone has their own life to live, and just the one. So go, but study how local self-government works in other countries. Study independent trade unions, political education among the poor and poorly educated, at the level of budgets, how all sorts of small things contribute to the struggle for a greater public good. And not only in the West, but in many countries, from India to Chile, where years of work have gone into the intersection of events and large universalist projects, something that we should learn firsthand. In recent years, it became obvious that we do have a generation of what we've called the democratic intelligentsia, people who are already ready to move on from a kind of eternal stupor in the face of their country, and also from individual acts of ethical protest, to actually taking responsibility, going into politics, becoming deputies, leaders of eco-movements and trade unions. I thought that this evolutionary process was inevitable and that we were basically on the right track. Now it seems savagely interrupted, but there's also some chance that in the end, this unchecked savagery will speed it up many times over and will send back to hell all that has prevented us going forward and that has now openly shown its dead and destructive nature. And I am sure that if we do not all perish, we will have a chance to build a new country and a new society. And at that point, we are going to need a lot of new people to help us, new politicians and officials, judges and deputies, even new priests and policemen. So be ready to come back and get your children ready. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I open the floor to questions, I would like to ask a question myself, using the privileged position. So, Marijeta, the title of your book is very, I would say, theoretically provocative. Avant-Garde Post, right? So we are used to say post-avant-garde, but you're saying avant-garde post. And in your talk and of course in your book, you I think build some kind of uninterrupted presence of avant-garde in the Russian culture, beginning with what we know about early Russian avant-garde, Soviet avant-garde, then adding Abiru as very important sort of trajectory of avant-garde that continues, but continues in a different direction than Soviet avant-garde, right? Then you are looking back at the underground, and of course figure of Prigov as in your talk in your book, and certainly among the poets who are protagonists of your book, Aleksandr Skidan is directly and personally, biographically and generationally, connects with the late Soviet underground, right? And here is this new wave group generation. It's not several generations, but let's say generation of Poetics. So how would you define their avant-garde vis-a-vis previous avant-gardes? What's for instance, you are citing Julia Weingut, who says that the early Soviet avant-garde has this concept of technique, according to her, right? Making of things, making of world that connects their political ideology with aesthetic language, right? You also cite Nina Buryanova, who finds the similar connection in anarchism of early avant-gardists, right? So throwing books as bombs, right? Is there anything comparable in this very diverse group of poets that might define the avant-gardism as not only just borrowing from development further, but as the more or less new and independent generational formation?
I think I understand, and maybe I'll try to answer in a few parts. The first is in terms of the avant-garde itself and the use of the term and the understanding of the term. One thing that I write about in the introduction of the book is that for a while avant-garde was a dirty term, as it were, a polluted term. In fact, there's been such a proliferation of works declaring the death of the avant-garde that it becomes a kind of topic, a trope, a machine for generating claims that the avant-garde is dead. And if we look at the number of the authors, the critics, the intellectuals who proclaimed the death of the avant-garde from a variety of different political positions, and we look at the timing of these critiques, it really checks out with the kind of middle and end of the Cold War. And in the post-Cold War context, you start to see a kind of reemergence of the term in a variety of different contexts. So, the way that I use it, on one hand, I try to look at these particular historical waves that are being appropriated, for sure, but also really to think of the term trans-historically, again, as just a kind of reaction against, a subversion against, through a variety of different means. So that's one thing I would say about my usage of it. And again, the kind of how do you interpret this kind of critical energy, emancipatory energy in a space post, as you said, a kind of position of feeling perpetually after both crisis, but after a failed emancipatory experiment. The ways in which they do something dramatically different from previous generations have to do with, again, remediation practices, a series of complicated remediation practices, a kind of perpetual deferral and openness through the reperformance in various ways. Again, maybe, something like Keti Chukhrov's video art based on performance, but then there's a verse play. So works like the poetry works more like musical notation rather than end product as poem. Again, in the ways that we can now digitally remediate, spread, translate. This works in a different fashion than Aberiu, for example, or even early Prigov. But I would also say, again, the remediation and the borrowing is a purposeful interest in showing the non-originality of both a kind of experiment and political stance. And this is part of what is being explored, of what can we simply go back to and take completely seriously as if it were written in this moment, and see how that creates some kind of rupture and possibility. So maybe there's a kind of Borgesian, rewrite Don Quixote again, word for word, but it's completely new.
So the gesture of the tournament, in a way. Right?
And yeah, absolutely. Very, very central. And again, they study Guy Debord.
Yeah, and this
Right.
of course. All right. Any other questions? Because I have more. Occupy the floor.
Go ahead.
Seriously, don't have that.
One of the things that strikes me is that what they have that none of the previous avant-gardes had is technology in a way that expands the possibility of different aspects of production or combination or, use of such an amazing variety of different approaches in one experience. And that's something that, yes, it's there in a very primitive form, and, as some of the earlier groups did not agree that it is now really, I would think, central to just about everything they produce.
Thank you. And Julia Vingert, who Mark mentioned, writes about the first Russian avant-garde as very much influenced by an explosion in new technological possibility for its time. Again, a number of critics have argued that we're in a similar moment to the early 20th century in terms of the explosion of technology and then aesthetic experimentation around that. But you're right that the immediacy and spread is, of course, very different. Mark had said something earlier before this talk about, we should tell Aleksandr Skidan that you're here and we're talking. Skidan already knows and commented on Facebook. So that's a very different kind of immediacy and shock of synchrony between different communities than we saw in the early 20th century or late 20th century for that matter.
Right,
Yeah, thank you for a really great talk. And I've already started reading the book, already enjoying it. So I'm curious about if you notice any moments of mistranslation or misunderstanding within the transnational networks that you talk about, because we think about the historical avant-garde, similarly between the Russian and Italian futurists, Marinetti kind of dismiss them completely. So I'm curious if you have any moments of tension within or not within the transnational circuits.
Absolutely, great question. And actually, this image pertains to that. One of the many times that I had Dmitry Golynko invited him to Yale for a combination of intellectual conferences and poetic readings. And at every single time, there was total misunderstanding between groups. And again, the shock of synchrony makes evident the dramatically different sets of assumptions that people are bringing to the table. So I'll give one kind of poetic example. We had Golynko, Medvedev, Rymbu, I think Arseniev reading, and then there were a number of American leftist radical poets. And after everybody read and there was a conversation, the American poets said, this is crap what you're doing. Where's the race? Where's the attention to race as the kind of central point? And then the others said, well, this is a different context. It's not the central point. This is a different kind of project. Again, complete lack of communication over that issue of why is critical race theory so absent in some of the work, or seemingly so absent. Difficult to say in the work of Keti Chukhrov. But let's say in the academic intellectual context, discussions of interesting theory, interesting theoretical approaches, American academics say to the Russian group, who's still reading Rancière? We already did this 20 years ago. Which again, one reading is to see it as a kind of belated arriving late to a kind of global discourse of leftist political thought. Another is to say with interest, how is Rancière being used in a contemporary context that feels really fresh and useful, and why on earth does it not work? Is it not read in such a way in an American academic context in 2017? So phenomenal question.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I would just follow back what Mark asked you about what makes this group or generation or poetry production different from the previous generations. Maybe this is more comment and you can continue if it makes sense rather than a question. To me, it seems that this question of pragmatic function of language and pragmatism itself becomes very specific for the 21st century. And Yeah, I'll just throw it out there. Do you see that? Does that play out in the output of these poems that you're looking at?
Great insight, and absolutely. I think the 7 poets that I look at have really dramatically different praxis. So for some of them, it's really direct, and others less so. So again, the range, someone like Kirill Medvedev, while again his poetry can be quite difficult, quite challenging in certain ways, it's very clear where he is in the kind of, I don't know, Adorno versus Lukács. How readable should something be? Who should be able to read it? So other ways that he's found of reaching broader audiences include his band. I think his proudest moment came when a group of independent labor union organizers for a conference commissioned an album from his band, where they said, we need music that will help us kind of raise spirits. And they called this album simply Music for the Working Class. So this was, again, proudest moment in his life. He's like, aha, now I have an answer to the question of, but what you said to people for your, silly poetry. They commissioned it. That may be one extreme. Skidan's poetry that requires that you've recently worked through Hegel, Kant, have about 6 European languages at your ready disposal, is much more. And again, this is the linkage with the late Soviet. Skidan worked as a stoker in the late Soviet period, so we've got that direct late Soviet romantic line of descent. This is far more Aesopian, far more of a kind of language game that is purposefully resisting pressure to be to expand beyond the language game, politicized language game, claiming that itself is emancipatory and a mode of stepping outside of certain capitalist economies.
I was wondering about the poetics of powerlessness, which is something you talk about in your introduction. And I'm curious about whether that could potentially be a distinguishing category in terms of thinking about this new wave of the avant-garde, because this powerlessness is not necessarily the category we mostly associate with the previous ones. At the same time, I'm also curious about what you think about the category of powerlessness and the way it's in sync with a lot of trends in our contemporary poetry in the Western context, which is Black poetry, because it seems like it's something really, the idea of thinking about powerlessness as something that could be a critical category is both new for the post-Soviet context and very much in tune with our global trends in poetry, in Black poetry, for instance. So.
And the questions that you had sent me, you mentioned Moten specifically, and absolutely, this is one of the poet scholars who offers a really amazing counterpart to this kind of work and an example of how this is part of a larger global phenomenon. And I think you're exactly right in the things that you've said. I mean, also the term itself comes from Sian Nai's work and her interest in the cuteness of the avant-garde and kawaii, and a different mode of thinking about kitsch, right? Again, I think one of the things this is pointing to is the kind of purposeful rejection of a kind of avant-gardist virility and masculinism, and instead an emphasis on the powerlessness, on the cuteness, on the smallness in many of these projects. Again, offers up space for critique, tools of critique in a number of different ways, in a kind of implicit and obvious stance against discourses of power, or kind of on its own skin. I also think of Anne Boyer, whose work is really interesting here in an American feminist context, showing through kind of immensely linguistically clever performance of abject pain and ego destruction, what the subject of late capitalism looks like. Again, through performing it, through putting it into words, it stops there. But now you have put it into words, now you have created a kind of language of critique. Let others then do with this performance of powerlessness what they will.
So
I had two sort of related questions. I came in 2 minutes late, so it's quite possible that you already addressed them. But I'm thinking of the trajectory of these people through international media spaces, institutional spaces. And I see some parallels where I see a younger generation of Russian artists, humanists, intellectuals whose careers in Russia might be frustrated either from politics, from the decay of the institutional channels in which they might otherwise move, or from blockage because an older generation is already occupying the roles they might like to occupy, that they then like detour through the West and like acquire prestige funding, institutional support, etc., through like European arts funding and the biennial circuit, through the American university, etc., and then can sort of like parlay that into, you know, a career, or perhaps try to reconvert it into domestic capital, so to speak, if we're using a term. So two questions I have about this. So first is, do they have any critique perhaps of the way that their leftist avant-gardist practice routes itself through imperial centers of institutional power? And then second, in what field in the Russophone or Russian, what field of Russian or Russophone poetics, like what is their position in a broader field? What are other poetic projects that are not routed through these Western circuits, that are not necessarily leftist? Are they speaking to in Russia?
Two really amazing and important questions. So one, in terms of the kind of self-critique of, you know, who are you complicit with, through, you know, funding sources, means of survival. Again, you'll see it in the work and the writing of many of them. Keti Chukhrov's verse plays inevitably have a character who is a stand-in for an artist, a metropolitan figure who is profiting from everything that she is documenting. So there tends to be in there, it's kind of quite explicit and dramatized, with a kind of despairing open-endedness, or, you know, how do you survive? You know, who are you willing to work with in order to survive? How do you pick which, you know, enemies of your enemies you can briefly sit down with, or whose money you are willing to spend? Again, explicitly dramatized in that work. Kirill Medvedev talks about it more in his political essays. Someone like absolutely, yeah, and he's the purist. Also, again, on the spectrum of who are you willing to work with, he's willing to work with the least. And perhaps Keti Chukhrov
work is in some sense like less well suited for the biennial circuit.
Exactly. Absolutely. But in one way or another, I would say that all of them kind of interrogate, fail better, you know, see their practices not as achieving some kind of purity, but as struggling to figure out, you know, how to exist. How do you create some kind of spaces of alternative economies while needing, nevertheless, to eat? Again, Kirill Medvedev seems to not need to eat. That other people give him.
Yep.
But I'll say in this kind of context.
He thinks for supper.
But I will say, again, you know, in direct conversations we had, like from an earlier era, when coming to US universities, people would ask him questions of like, how can you possibly stand to be at a place like Yale? And he's like, it's not my problem. You know, I'm focusing on a different problem right now. Let, you know, your local New Haven poet activists throw the bombs here. You have to pick your battles. But I will say, I mentioned Krytyka Polityczna from Poland. I'll say there was a kind of really interesting case study, planned collaboration, political critique. Also started as a journal, a newspaper, then various cultural centers that spread all across Poland. They had, you know, a republication of Lenin's work in Polish with a afterword by Zizek. All kinds of things that were highly provocative, again, in the Polish context, differently so than in Moscow. They became so popular that they opened then centers in other countries. They're Soros funded, EU funded, and at some point a collaboration was planned between some members of the Translate group Что делать and Krytyka Polityczna. These two groups met in St. Petersburg. And the Polish leftists were in suits. They were talking about how to do grant applications. The Russian leftists were looking at them and being like, absolutely not, none of this. So they're really, again, there's another example of non-synchrony or synchrony in time, showing dramatically different sets of assumptions. Again, and with political manifestations. Remind me the second question.
The second question, the communication with other.
Oh,
Where are
absolutely,
they
yeah.
situated in a
Yeah.
Russian
Good.
arts?
Yeah.
Like, are they in
Yeah.
fact even part of one, or are they basically part of an internationalized, translated
Right.
poetic world where they have a certain place?
And again, the answer to that question might change over time. But I will say that Mark had mentioned this is already more than one generation. Again, Skidan comes of age in a Soviet context. Golynko is kind of exactly post-Soviet. Medvedev, 5-6 years younger still. Galina Rymbu is of a different generation than Medvedev. So exactly. So we see a kind of spread there. For Galina Rymbu and her friends growing up, she has said, and she grew up in Omsk, that Kirill Medvedev kind of had become taken on the status of a kind of contemporary literary classic. So for a generation of poets of young aspiring poets who was disgruntled for whatever set of reasons, including socioeconomic, but again, including for a bunch of feminist poets and LGBTQ activist poets, Medvedev kind of opened the door, made them think that a certain kind of writing was possible. Galina Rymbu is now herself that for a still younger generation of poets. So it's actually kind of amazing what young people are in fact reading, who are not embedded in these Western transnational conversations.
If I may add, so they definitely overlap with several other circles, and it is overlap, sort of not full communicating, full overlap, but partial, right? So, for instance, with the feminist poetry, it's very prominent now, and of course, Rymbu is a part of that group, and feminist poetry, poets published in translated print, right? Then the very broad and very eclectic circle of let's say NLO poetry. They have huge poetic series published various poets, but Skidan creates this series. That's why sort of he's present there not only as the author but also as editor. But it doesn't mean that he published only those poets that are close to him.
Daily Prize, Dragomoshenko Prize.
Yeah, Dragomoshenko Prize is a somewhat different circle of, first of all, very young poets of Rymbu's generation, and very hermetic poets in many ways, right? But again, there are certain lines of communication. Then there is a very dramatic, I would say, relations with the circle of Vavilon and Dmitry Kuzmin, because there was famous war between Kuzmin and, or rather between Medvedev and Kuzmin, where he was accusing Kuzmin of God knows what. But still, Kuzmin was the first to publish with me, right? So yeah, they are very much present, and this sort of interpolation is there. They are not isolated.
Sorry, last tweak on that question I want to get though. But are there either groups or positions in poetics within Russia that they are opposed to, that they are writing in opposition to?
Again, there's a graduate student, Hyungmin Kim, who's working on a dissertation on this topic now, looking actually specifically at a number of poetry prizes and journals and spaces of publication in the 90s, and seeing the kind of emergence of a war for Russia in those spaces. So sure, you've got the various highly orthodox sites of publication. You've got a kind of more mystical, meandering meta-realists and their legacy school. You have the various things that are far more interested in policing boundaries of Russian language, normative, non-normative, placing boundaries of gender, highly gendered poetry, various kinds. We've got patriotic poetry.
There
Yeah.
are journals, though. There were there. So, for instance, the Journal of Poetry, which was very conservative position. Actually, it's very easy because those who are using crime now and those who are not using crime and different kinds of metric schemes are belonging to opposite cultural continents. Rhyme is a divider, I would say.
Although Osminkin rhymes.
Sometimes this is also accidental. Right, any other questions? All right, well.